I take a slightly different tack to perhaps some of what you've heard before. A lot of the conversation around brands and participation in the gTLD process has essentially been around focusing on the domain name and the brand benefits associated with that. But what the applicants have are actually a gTLD registry system, and that's a lot more complicated than just simply a naming convention. So what does that mean? So this is what I'm going to cover. Growing body of evidence and opinion that we are now in the midst of a third industrial revolution, and digital technologies are very much driving that revolution. So what does that mean? Digital technologies pretty much centered on the internet and the web. And the key three big changes happening there are mobile, social, and the emergent Internet of Things. As I said, it's more than just a domain name. Brand applicants will be operating a gTLD registry system at the world root of the internet. So what are the key characteristics of that? What do you own? What capabilities is that going to provide your organization? And how can those capabilities map to sort of CXO business concerns? And then get into a little bit more sort of practical nuances of projects planned. So there's many brands still have some big questions to be answered. And then sort of practical considerations with regards to areas of governance, communications, budgets, etc. I will briefly touch upon sort of the brand's benefits as commonly cited and understood to date. But there are sort of different types of gTLDs in the application process. There was closed and there was open. But as we've all progressed through this process, that simple bifurcation has evolved to become a bit more nuanced, and sort of more stratification is emerging from that. And then finally, just to sort of wrap up, there are many actors here from the domain name industry. And whilst this liberalization of the key aspect of the internet's infrastructure will provide fantastic opportunities for many brands, there will also equally be very profound changes ahead for the domain name industry itself. So as I mentioned, a growing body of opinion and evidence that we are now in a third industrial revolution. So what does that mean? So the first revolution, late 19th century, second, early 20th century, mass production, and now we're in pretty much the digital revolution. So some of the key characteristics of each of those. Sources of energy have changed. We've gone from blast furnaces, steam engines, through to electrification, and now the ubiquitous lithium-ion batteries that are in everything. Analysts forecast that there will be 10 billion devices connected to the internet by the end of this decade, all of those powered by lithium-ion batteries. Critical changes to infrastructure in each of these revolutions. So initially it was railways, canals, roads. Then it went on to motorways, electrification, and so on. And now it's really very much internet-centric is driving this industrial revolution, as well as other things such as novel materials and breakthroughs in genetics. Internet was originally invented by the US military as a means of distributed communications network in the event of a nuclear bomb, reassuring, whilst the web emerged out of European civil research at the CERN Institute, primarily invented by Tim Berners-Lee and his team in the early 90s. Some of the other key drivers are smart software. I put software in quotes because it's not really software in many regards. It's greater use of artificial intelligence, agents and bots. Key difference in characteristics is that software can only operate within very clear, defined parameters to embedded codes and rules. Agents are adaptive and capable of change, and that's a key feature we'll see when we come on to the Internet of Things. And we're moving away from the second industrialization revolution was very much about mass production. Now with 3D printing, we're moving into an era of mass customization. And finally, each of these areas have been defined by real changes in standards. So it was the invention of general purpose machinery, looming mills, for example, Then sort of the principles of scientific management. Today we take it for granted. Sort of many people go to business school, study for an MBA, and learn about organizational and business management. But a century ago, this was really quite sort of novel introduction to organizations. Now the key standards are very much, again, with internet-centric, around communications, data transportation, knowledge exchange, automation of knowledge work, again through agents, able to decipher vast quantities of data and analytics, whether it's structured data or unstructured data. So a little bit more close in terms of the aspects of the digital drive in this industrial revolution. This is a chart from an analyst report, and essentially there's sort of 4 key levels. But I really want to sort of focus, going back to that point about infrastructure, here under enablers. Brand applicants is more than just a domain name. They've applied to operate their own secure gTLD registry at the world root of the internet. gTLD registries are a critical aspect of internet infrastructure. So what does that mean? We'll come on to that. In particular, I'll focus on the business impacts. So productivity, some of the customer-facing impacts and changes in terms of business models and processes. And just to follow on from Philip's slide earlier, in terms of technology does tend to sort of follow in decade phases. And we're seeing 3 big changes happening in the internet right now. The first is mobile, as completely surpassed desktop access. There's over 1 billion people currently using smartphones and tablets. This year, sales of those outstripped sales of laptops and desktop PCs. And the next wave of people, next 3 billion people coming onto the internet, their primary experience and access is going to be through a mobile device, not a desktop PC tethered to a desk with wires. And as mentioned, an estimate of 10 billion computing devices by the end of this decade. Most of them will be mobile. And here's just a figure in terms of economic impact over the next 20 years. Somewhere between $3.7 to $10.8 trillion. So very far-reaching changes. Next is in social media. So user-generated content, peer reviews, etc., on easy-to-use social networks and platforms. It is by far the most popular activity on the internet, and it's really been a very powerful information disruptor. For example, typically with communications, PR activity, whether it's corporate communications, the realm of diplomacy and political communications, it was very much a one-way broadcast. There was a relationship between the organization, kind of traditional media, and amplify that out to the general public. That's all been usurped by social media, and it's very much now a two-way dialogue. Conversations take place about your brand. You no longer have control of those conversations. You are now a participant in those. But going back even just to the mid-90s, I remember the early days of the web, and everyone was going to have their own website. Everybody would have their own domain name and create their own sort of like web page. Well, that didn't work out. Everyone can quite easily create user-generated content on these easy-to-use social networks, and none of those people need a domain name for that. And interestingly now, the social technologies are very rapidly moving into the next phase from the public arena and being very widely adopted within organizations in terms of knowledge and productivity gains. So again, with significant economic impact, but it's a little bit more difficult to quantify that. And this chart just really just shows the phenomenal growth in social media in the past 5 years. Over 1 billion users. And the third change in the internet is the Internet of Things. Quick straw poll, who here has heard of that term, is familiar with it? Oh, just a few people? I thought there would be more. Okay, so what is it? Ubiquitous connectivity enabled by very cheap, low-cost sensors embedded into practically everything and anything, combined with sort of near-field communications, such as RFID. So What that really means is you have every single thing that's manufactured, every device and so on can be a uniquely identifiable smart object, and it actively participates in the business process. So what I mean by that, so it's not just sort of supply chain management tracking and so on. There's monitors and sensors can send information back, remotely controlled, and then sort of, be adaptive, particularly if there's sort of any kind of intelligent agentware embedded within that. There can be a very broad spectrum in terms of the Internet of Things. But really sort of drive fundamental changes in terms of many business processes. And gTLDs, this is where you start to see a real example of that, in that a gTLD is a massively scalable database, the world root of the Internet. Every single product could have its own unique entry in the gTLD registry. There's one thing that says stop thinking domain names, and perhaps thinking about domain numbers. The volume of machine-to-machine or product-to-machine internet-generated traffic will far eclipse the traffic, human-generated internet traffic. All these devices, products, and so on, sending relay information to central servers. So the unique key field within the domain name registry can really be incorporated here to support Internet of Things. And the key characteristic there is embedded. So with mobile, the characteristic is portable and wearable devices. Social media, it's human interaction. In here, it's embedded into everyday objects. Again, forecast economic impact between $2.7 to $6.2 trillion. So very profound, large-scale changes. So what's all that got to do with you as a brand applicant? You've applied to an organization called ICANN to operate your own domain name. Well, you actually applied for a lot more than that. You applied for the right to operate a gTLD registry database. So just take a step back a moment. The liberalization process of this key aspect of the Internet's infrastructure was very carefully considered, long time in gestation. The draft applicant consultations around the draft applicant guidebook were over 6 years in total. I think there were 5 or maybe a final 6th version of the guidebook, Chris. But during that process, it was very much dominated by certain types of actors, first of which were the domain name industry, because registries and registrars were over the moon about this, whilst they may have expressed frustrations about the process, ultimately very excited about the outcome, because this was going to be a massive expansion of the existing domain name market. We're going to sell lots more domain names. On the other hand, representing the brands, representation largely came from legal counsel, who were rightly very concerned about trademark protection. Philip's analogy of living in an apartment block of dodgy neighbors, widespread, rampant, fraudulent criminal activity on the Internet, phishing and so on. So they were initially very hostile to the whole liberalization process. It's difficult enough to protect your IP with ever-expanding domain name portfolios against such criminal and fraudulent actors. Imagine what it's going to be like in a much more expanded universe of all these different types of domains. But over the course of that careful conversation and dialogue that ICANN engaged with all of the various stakeholders, there are now a number of trademark protection mechanisms at the top level have been developed. And that's a direct outcome of those dialogue conversation. And the other main constituency was security and stability. And, obviously ensuring that this expansion had no negative impact. ICANN is responsible for stability and security of this aspect into its infrastructure. So, not surprisingly, considering the actors, the focus of the conversation, much of the brand benefits really focused around the domain name. In a high-value term, what would be the brand association with that? Ease of addressing for customers and so on, and, to a certain extent, search engine optimization. But hardly anybody was talking about brands who were now going to operate their own hub within the Internet network, operating a key element of Internet infrastructure. So specifically in the example of KPMG, when this liberalization process was announced, we're very cognizant of the impact that the internet has had, very disruptive impact across a broad range of industry sectors and business models. So we conducted a really in-depth feasibility study, interviewed a lot of people, really in-depth report, and there was sort of an environmental analysis of what is this whole process and what's it all about. And even though we tried to sort of digest it down, it ended up being a humongous 73-slide deck. Very complicated process, but really it looked at some of these areas. Now, what are the strategic benefits? Competition, security, risk reduction, is this value for money? How can this act as a platform for innovation? That's a term you'll increasingly hear over and over. What about IDNs and sort of global footprint, etc.? So general concerns. So I kind of want to emphasize that KPMG did not apply just to operate its own domain name. 2 years ago, lots of brands would be complaining, $185,000, that seems very expensive for a domain name. No, that's because you weren't applying for domain name. You applied for the right to operate a secure gTLD registry at the world root of the internet. So what does that mean? What are the key characteristics? Well, first of all, super fast servers at the world root of the internet. Whilst most brand registries initially would be resolving queries lower than, say, .com registry currently resolves, eventually when we sort of get to the Internet of Things, which some of these brand registries are actually going to be resolving queries from millions and millions and millions of products and so on at any one point in real time in their supply chain. They have a proven ability to host millions of unique entries, so it can be massively scaled up. The financial services industry were a very important participant in the application guidebook and development, so security considerations were really quite central, and there are a range of security advantages in terms of owning and operating the gTLD. Much more secure point-to-point communications with DNSSEC, but also additional sort of certification and encryption possibilities. And these all begin to add into then applications, platform for innovation. And it's going to be, all of this is going to be quite disruptive. You're going to see one of the key things that ICANN embarked in this process was to enhance the utility of the DNS domain space. Wasn't just about expanding the domain name market, it was enhancing the utility of DNS and functionality. And then finally, this is sort of where a lot of that conversation has focused on for brands to date. Typical brand benefits around attributes and so on. So to pick up on Frank Schilling's comments earlier today that, it's only a matter of time before you see a billboard advert that says drive.bmw. But a big issue in the automotive industry at the moment are autonomous and self-autonomous cars, widely tipped to be mass available by the end of this decade. It's over 2 years since Google proved a car drove 100 miles through LA included with a robotic autonomous car. So all of those cars packed full of electronics, sensors, and connected to the internet. Each of those cars are going to have a chip with a unique registry entry in the .bmw registry, and that unique entry is going to be used for verification and access to information updates and so on, just as an example. So mapping this to sort of business concerns, speaking to an executive, what does this really mean for me? So sort of a few slides here, some of the key concerns for whether it's CEO, CFO, CIO, customer revenue growth, customer relationships, new products and services, more marketing investment and so on. And here sort of to the right, you can see then just some examples and food for thought for how gTLD registry can support this topic. It's going to be a platform for innovation in terms of digital delivery of customer services. Customers could signal their brand affinity through a unique domain, but they'll have to be educated and incentivized to do that. And supports a shift to internet-centric business processes. Similarly, with operating effectiveness, some concerns there again: intellectual property, innovation, business processes, just some of the key features there. Going through these, other areas of concern are transformation, technology change, IT management, etc. Some of the key concerns, for example, with transformation is the rapid changes that have happened across so many industry sectors through this digital technologies and this third industrial revolution that we're in, very profound, large-scale changes. So many organizations are concerned with flexibility and adaptability. A gTLD registry is essentially internet infrastructure as a service. It's a hugely scalable platform outsourced to expert third-party partners, and can act as an applicant or platform for innovation. But the key difference here is that whilst many internet innovations and so on, particularly in the realm of digital marketing, can be quickly observed, reverse engineered, and replicated, that's not the case for gTLD registries. This liberalization process has progressed in sort of carefully managed phases. So there will undoubtedly be a second wave of liberalization. Chris, I'm looking at you. Maybe there's some insight you'll give us later. But absolutely, this will scale up with many more applicants in the future. However, those applicants, those of you in the room who are amongst the first wave of applicants, enjoy a unique competitive advantage. And when you start to see some of these applications go live with these registries, that's something that's not going to be able to be replicated by competitor organizations because they weren't among the first wave of applicants. So as these gTLD registries, particularly the brand registries who are primarily motivated as a platform for innovation, as real-world examples start to go online, whether it changes the business processes or even in new business models, it will undoubtedly, there'll be a penny drops across boardrooms, and they'll realize what really this is in terms of gTLD registries. And just finally, sort of two other areas there, sort of, IT management and data analytics. Large-scale data sets as really being viewed as a key source of customer insights, operational efficiency. And currently today, you have a domain and it's a third-party relationship. You purchase the domain through a registrar who in turn gets it from the registry, and there's an arm's length relationship. And you don't have much insight into the information and traffic flows that happen on that registry. Similarly with social networks, you had the example earlier today where brands invest a lot of money into driving traffic to networks such as Twitter and Facebook, and then have to pay those organizations even more money to advertise to reach those same customers. gTLD registries are infrastructure as a service. It will quite readily evolve into software or platform as a service. And you will see the emergence of third-party managed services. So, for example, yesterday, the Brand Registry Group had a working session in the afternoon and had a fantastic presentation from a technology company which essentially has developed a managed service to operate your own secure social network of your gTLD registry. And what a large global bank has signed up for this. So rather than engage with its customers via a platform such as Facebook, it will now have its own secure social network that will operate as a managed service on top of its internet infrastructure as a service. One final thing I'd like to say here is that disaster recovery is always important from an IT perspective. Your gTLD is at the zone files at the world root of the internet. So if something happens there, I think we've all got a much bigger problem. The world root of the internet has gone down. Okay, so let's move into sort of some more specific considerations in terms of the project plan for launch. Before shaping up a project plan, you have to be very clear and understand what it is that you have applied and own, and the potential of that for your organization and how that can support. So seeing some of the key characteristics, how those can map to executive level concerns and develop greater organizational capability. But at this point, there's still a lot of brands that have to really address some big questions. Again, too much of the conversation to date has been focused around domain name and not operating a registry. So are there clearly articulated business use cases? What's the prioritization and phasing of those timescales? This is a medium-term transition. How can this registry database support those CXO concerns in your organization? Are you clear on responsibilities to ICANN? I'm not going to read through all of those, but specifically in your organization, just some of the key areas of concern would be around governance. Is there an executive sponsor? A steering group of senior business unit leaders, and then a implementation operational group that's going to drive this within the business. Lots of contracts. Everyone has their contract for a registry service provider. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a successful applicant. But you will have to sign a contract with ICANN, as well as registrars and other third parties. Who's doing what? There's a large cast of actors involved, so it's worthwhile sitting down, mapping this out, and developing a RACI model. And then also in terms of budgets, is this really on the horizon? Will some of this be funded from a central operational budget? Or, for example, will innovation and development be funded from those business units, their own operational budgets? In terms of management processes, internal comms, and even promotion if you're an open gTLD. So management processes, there's a lot of responsibility. You're going to have to ensure compliance and reporting, not just to ICANN and your own internal policies, but legislative and jurisdictional requirements, for example, EU data protection. To get real value out of this infrastructure, there's going to be a lot of integration of existing enterprise systems, for example, supply chain systems, customer CRM databases into that. So that's going to be a significant systems integration effort. Analytics and reporting, both in terms of tool sets, expertise, and people. And just really having sufficiently staffed to support all of this as it gets scaled up. In too many organizations, this has been championed by a very small handful of individuals, 1 or 2, 3 key individuals who are informed and have acted as champions, whilst much of the rest of the organization remains dimly, vaguely cognizant or completely unaware of this process. But regardless of whether you are planning to operate as a closed brand gTLD or an open and selling domains on the open market, everyone is going to have to develop communications, stakeholder engagement plans along a spectrum. So even if you're a closed registry, your allocations into the DNS will be driven by business use case scenarios. You're still going to have to internally communicate and also to third parties. Whereas if you're going to be an open gTLD and look to sell or give away lots and lots of domain names, you're going to have to educate and entice a significant customer base and the general public. So really just to look, to come back to some of those brand benefits, much of the conversation to date has been around this area, particularly the domain name. So just a quick recap, there's an overall halo effect. It enhances your brand, is projecting it as as a very public, worldwide statement about your organization. So it's positioned as an innovative, technically savvy. It's going to give you much greater degree of control of your brand in digital channels. You control who's in or who's out of the registry. But as I mentioned, there will be a third level of managed services, for example, secure social networks that you operate and own. So much greater degree of insight and control. Some brand affinity. Customers will be willing to signal their brand affinity. There's already established precedent with social media, where lots of people like, endorse, follow, recommend brand activity. So look to campaigns and initiatives that your organization has done and other best practices with social media marketing in terms of then when it comes to incentivizing customer base to engage with new gTLD. It's often mentioned that sort of this will be a benefit for SEO, but a note of caution, it's not that simplistic. Google have purportedly over 100 different criteria in their ranking algorithms. They continually shift and change that. Yes, the domain name is an important signifier and contributes to the ranking. So what type of domain name is it? .gov, .com, is it a personal domain? And what's the keyword there? But it still doesn't remove the need to address other aspects of SEO. Is your website technically optimized for indexing and crawling? For example, XML sitemaps. And importantly, is your content written for the web? You know, different locations and terms and words are more valuable than others. And links analysis, you know, so it's only one aspect. Don't oversell this. Importantly, lots of analytics and insights from that information flow in your registry. On the corollary, you know, we saw earlier a lot of the actors involved were legal brand counsel. So this is perhaps an opportune moment to really look at overall IP brand protection. In many organizations, you have a disjointed sort of effort between trademark protection, domain names, going out and monitoring the internet for things like logos or infringements on content, etc. So it's perhaps an opportune moment to really sort of, from an organizational perspective, to look at all of those different actors in the organization and sort of essentially centralize brand protection across these different areas. You know, whether it's domain names, whether it's going to be within your gTLD registry and then on other new gTLD registries and other types of infringement. You do have obligations to other brands, more notably if you're planning to operate as an open gTLD, but you yourself have lots of options for trademark protections at the top level. Some of them with very long names. So during the application process, there were two categories. Are you closed or are you open? But as we've evolved through this process, that simple binary bifurcation has become much more nuanced. And so what's emerging is that there's just a bit of a stratification. So, for example, a brand applicant who's applied as a closed, you know, but they might actually, their business plan would be to give away millions and millions of these domains to their customer base. So really sort of what does that mean? You know, and you could produce a much more in-depth table here than just a sort of simple high level. But what I really wanted to sort of highlight was sort of the key differences in motivation. Earlier we heard from Philip that brands will be a primary driver of innovation in the utility of the DNS space. At the moment, the ICANN contract is very much evolved from where it came historically, in that it's very much concerned with rights and responsibilities with regards to selling domain names. But that's not of any interest to many of the closed brand applicants who are primarily motivated with regards to exploiting these gTLD registry capabilities. So their incentive is to innovate. Open gTLDs, their incentive is to promote or sell lots of domains, very different. And one aspect of that is, for example, as a registry operator, you are required to have registrars to place domains into your registry database. So if you're a closed registry, you only really need one. So you want to really look at a trusted relationship and capabilities, whereas if you're an open gTLD, you want to maximize your channels to market. So you want to create an ecosystem of registry partners. So very different considerations there in terms of why should they sell your domains or act as distributors for your domains. As I mentioned earlier, regardless of where you are in this spectrum, everyone's going to have to be involved with regards to make investments in marketing and communications to drive adoption. So how does all of this fit into sort of is it budgeted for? Are you speaking to change management professionals in your organization to help you drive this? Perhaps you have a central project management office. You know, the scope and scale and the number of actors that need to be involved to make this successful is a large cast. So just to sort of wrap up, I'd like to sort of close with some considerations for the domain name industry itself. This liberalization process is a fantastic opportunity. For the first time, brands will be enabled to operate their own part of the internet infrastructure and therefore build their own networks off that. And what is that going to mean for the domain industry? So I'll show a very brief video in terms of, this was a video that I contributed to for ICANN. Chris actually very kindly invited me. So it's an excerpt from that video which is talking about the opportunities for the domain name industry.
What is the biggest opportunity for the internet domain name industry?
Domain name industry today has a big opportunity. The most obvious one is the expansion of the generic TLD space.
And that change will be driven by probably around 50% of the world's population being online in the next 4 years, and more to come. There's the huge change from technology that's always developing, and we've got more development to come as well.
A lot of growth, a lot of innovation, exploration of new models, new business models, and new methods of using domain names that have not been seen before.
With the rise of the Internet of Things, the number of computational devices, whether phones, computers, but also ordinary household appliances, factory equipment, plant machinery, etc., that will be connected to a more intelligent semantic web will far eclipse the number of people who live on this planet.
But perhaps the most important opportunity is making that extension and expansion useful. The historical generic top-level domains were very, very general in their character.
Domain names have sort of lost a lot of their relevance to the everyman, primarily because naming is complicated, and there isn't really a good way to register names and then manage names, acquire hosting services, subsequent management. It's so much easier for consumers of the web, regular people from all walks of life, just to go to Facebook or Twitter, sign up for an account, and label their content on the web using those tools. So there's been a lot of innovation lacking in naming.
The ones that have been proposed now, the some 2,000 or so, are much more specific, and there are questions in my mind and in the minds of others as to the utility of some of those very specific choices of top-level domain.
It's the age of the empowered customer, and if you look around, you'll see that disruption is everywhere you look. Every industry, the music industry, publishing, journalism, travel, finance, phones, gadgets, auto industry, and the list goes on and on. Empowered customers have really disrupted business models across every single industry, even in those you least expect. So I do believe that even as great as its legacy has been, .com is not immune to the great force of disruption that the influx of innovative .anythings and .everythings will no doubt create.
Companies from all corners of the world innovating and reimagining how names are used and put in the hands of consumers. That to me is the biggest opportunity facing names and the name industry this coming year.
Well, the biggest opportunity is perhaps not so much domain names, but domain numbers, or more accurately, domain serial numbers. With the rise of the Internet of Things, the number of computational devices, whether phones, computers, but also ordinary household appliances, factory equipment, plant machinery, etc., that will be connected to a more intelligent semantic web will far eclipse the number of people who live on this planet. So in the medium to longer term, the biggest opportunity is without a doubt working with private organizations who have secured the right to operate their own secure registry at the world root of the internet. And many of those organizations will intend to utilize that registry database. Each domain serial code is a unique number which will be used to authenticate secure access to delivery of innovative digital services or transfer of information.
So it remains to be seen how well they are used to make the internet space functionally valuable for users.
So more users online, more customers, more technology, we all need to change to respond to that. That's the opportunity.
So, the impact on the industry is that there will be a stratification of both registrars and registries. There'll be greater diversification. The emphasis to date has been on selling domain names and channels to market. Now, this will be a driver for innovation, providing sort of those registry, both DNS operations, so outsource infrastructure as a service, but also the enhancements that will inevitably be demanded by Fortune 500 type organizations seeking to integrate their enterprise systems to the gTLD registry database. They also see lots of third-party value-added managed services which can be bolted on. So, for example, yesterday we had a demonstration of a secure social network. It's driven off the gTLDs. So, some of the other impacts could be regionalization. Some registrars might choose to focus in terms by, say, by geography or by IDNs. And certainly the existing open gTLDs are going to be impacted without a doubt. There will be much more increased competition, which is really going to force a focus on improved behavior, operational efficiencies, the relationships with registrars, completeness of the WHOIS database, stepping up marketing, and so some of the innovation in terms of, as I said, new DNS services demanded by large organizations. And there will be from an IP concern, a bigger secondary market in reselling domains. So finally, to conclude, is that, key impact is that this is actually going to force greater transparency and accountability on the part of the domain name industry. And the constituencies involved, for example, in ICANN consultations, to date, they're sort of somewhat obscure, perhaps technical policy issues that really sort of the industry can get itself worked up over. They don't really resonate with the board level, and certainly not with the public. So the nature of the discourse and dialogue is going to evolve and shift much more in terms of the arena of those types of CXO concerns that we saw earlier. One final thing is that, to me, it's a little bit disappointing that through this first round of liberalization, there only really has been one new major registry operator has emerged, which namely Google. It may well be in time that many of those Fortune 500 organizations choose to insource their registry operations and develop the capability themselves, particularly if it becomes of critical strategic value or sensitivity. But nonetheless, it's a note for ICANN to consider that in liberalizing the gTLD space, also needs to correspondingly inject competition into the providers of the back-end systems and infrastructure that will enable that liberalization. Otherwise, you've got a bottleneck. And just really to conclude, I think that if there's one thing I would say about the gTLD liberalization process is that this is going to have a profound impact in terms of business models, business processes, and there will be new ways of using DNS that we've just not seen before. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you very much for that very rich presentation. I think it's very valuable. The question I have for you is, since you mentioned the Internet of Things and your plans, you mentioned something like DNS serial numbers, and I wonder whether you could just a little bit expand on that, what your plans are with regards to the Internet of Things and serving it as a closed registry.
Well, KPMG is a professional services organization, so it doesn't actually make any things. It provides sort of advisory tax audit services to clients around the world. So the impact of the Internet of Things really applies to other different industry sectors. So the example I cited earlier, yes, there will be drive.bmw, which is very powerful from a branding perspective, but just as importantly, the semi-autonomous, autonomous cars that will be rolling off the assembly lines, they will be packed full of electronic circuitry and software, and part of that will include unique domain registry entries for each and every car in terms of connection and authentication to the registry database in terms of accessing other information or services or updates that are all going to be driven through that infrastructure. So you'll see gTLD registries evolve from being just simply infrastructure to software as a service to essentially a platform as a service. Those are the three aspects of cloud computing.
Thank you very much. I thought you mentioned DNS serial numbers, if you had any kind of protocol that you were referring there when you were speaking about that.
Well, there's lots of existing protocols with regards to, for example, electronic product codes, uniform resource identifiers. You know, these are something that have been well established and are embedded in RFID chips. But a URI is agnostic of the carrier. An RFID chip is just the carrier. So you quite easily see that sort of unique gTLD domain registries will become the URI, and then the carrier may well be an RFID chip or other kind of type of carrier.